May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. At the 9 o'clock service, we sang a different sequence hymn, and the words caught me this morning. I think they were very appropriate, considering the passages that we read. The first verse, signs of endings all around us, darkness, death, and winter days shroud our lives in fear and sadness, numbing mouths that long to praise. Come, O Christ, and dwell among us. Unless you've been living under a rock, you will have noticed that the last 2 weeks, some of our brothers and sisters are in a euphoric mode, totally elated. And some of our friends are at the lowest of lows. In times like these, in times of uncertainty and change, passages like ours today in Daniel remind us, thankfully, of God's enduring presence and the promise of hope that lies beneath our present fears. The intensity of Daniel's vision resonates with the fears many feel in these current times of political transition. But every 4 years, we watch as national leadership shifts, and with it comes the anticipation of change. It's inevitable. Some like the changes that are coming, and some don't. But either way, in Daniel, we're reminded that we're part of a greater story. The cycles of human leadership, while they are significant, are but a part of a grand narrative of God's plan for salvation and ultimately peace. In Daniel's vision, you'll notice in your bulletins that there are 2 outcomes that await those who, quote unquote, sleep in the dust. Number 1 is everlasting life. And number 2 is shame and everlasting contempt. It's a stark contrast that calls us to a life of wisdom and righteousness and faithfulness to God. While leaders may come and go, and they do, those who seek and practice righteousness in their lives, according to Daniel, they shine like the brightness of the sky. This shining is not merely for our personal fulfillment. This shining radiates hope for others. As Christians, we're called to reflect God's light. That is our call, especially in times when many are struggling to find hope. That is our call. No matter who sits in the highest offices, no matter who sits in our highest offices, God is our true protector. God is making staff appointments all the time. There are angels among us, like the archangel Michael, whom God used as a protector 5 times throughout the Old and New Testaments, was prominent in our passage today. And for every person who fears the unknown, there is assurance in knowing that God's promise of deliverance is firm. Our role in this grand narrative is not to be swept away by the tides of uncertainty, but we are to embody the values of God's kingdom, to shine like stars in the night, illuminating the way toward justice, compassion, love, and righteousness and grace. Daniel's vision speaks directly to us in our time. It encourages us to trust in God's providence, to be wise, to be patient, and hold fast to what is true and just, knowing that God's kingdom endures. God's kingdom endures beyond our earthly powers. Daniel's audience thought that the world was coming to an end, and there are times, too, when we do as well. Our present generation, or the last couple of decades, we've designated many times that we're meeting the apocalypse in our midst. And one might ask, today, is the world spiraling to an end? Or is it the same old place that it's always been? Terror has always been a part of the human story. Terror. And in my opinion, there's nothing more terrifying, for some especially, than the overwhelming doom of being on death's doorstep, on being in the midst of apocalyptic times, or being in our own personal apocalypse, our own death. But as I've seen so many times, especially as a chaplain walking the halls of the hospital, the human spirit is amazing, especially when it's buoyed by faith. As a chaplain, daily walking along many who died, holding the hands of family members and those dying, my experience was that people really became focused at the end, focused on things like reconciliation and forgiveness, and just kind of cleaning things up, tidying up the mess that they made before they leave this world. Some of you might recall that I love classic movies, and in one particular one, Death of a Scoundrel, it starred George Sanders and Yvonne DiCarlo. Remember the Munsters? Sanders' character was a menace. He was a living, walking apocalypse. He left a trail of devastation in his path. He was conniving. And his evil ways made him a ton of money at the expense of others. But you guessed it, like most bullies, ultimately, Sanders' character caught up with him. And he was mortally shot by someone whom he'd hurt. And it took a while for him to die, though. And in this poignant death scene, as he was bleeding and dying, he made a decision. Now, all that money that he had stolen, he had transferred into stocks. And he made the decision in the last act of his life to sign over all the stock that he had accumulated to his victims. And he did that. It was because he turned the mirror on himself and he didn't like what he saw. I think of it as just another instance of someone tidying things up before they leave. We all have to admit that there's a lot of uncertainty out there in our world today. Sabers are rattling all around the globe. Fear that terrifying events could be on our doorstep, and they could. But you know what? It won't be the first time. For instance, in our gospel passage today, in Mark's gospel, it was written at a time when Rome was sacking Jerusalem. It was the first gospel written, and during that time, Rome tore down the temple, tore it down to the ground. That must have felt like the apocalypse to the Jews. And it was in these dark days that John Mark wrote about what Jesus said regarding the utter destruction of Jerusalem. And the disciples were confused and confounded by this. Of course, they were always confused, as are we. So Jesus offered up a profound message of endurance and discernment and perspective to his closest disciples. They asked for a sign. We always want a sign. And when they ask for a sign, what are they asking for? They're asking for a prediction. They want to know the outcome. They want to know what's the roadmap to this destruction. We want to see it. Tell us. Inquiring minds want to know. But Jesus instead shifted their focus from when it would happen to how they should live. How they should live. And of course, it's how we should live. The message is enduring. It's a timeless message. This is a message of how we should live in these days that might be trying to you. First thing Jesus warns is of deception. Jesus warns, he says, beware that no one leads you astray. That acknowledges that in times of uncertainty, in times of fear, people are more vulnerable. We're vulnerable to those who claim to have all the answers, because that's what we want, is answers. He cautions his disciples to stay grounded and not be swayed by false messiahs who claim certainty, saying, look out for deceptive, charismatic voices. That's what Jesus said. And secondly, Jesus said, well, he talked about the reality of upheaval in the world, wars and conflicts and natural disasters. And rather than interpreting these as immediate signs of the end, Jesus encourages his disciples to not be alarmed. Do not fear. Such events are painful, but they're not unique to you or to any other single generation. They've occurred throughout human history. He refers to them as the beginning of birth pangs. The beginning of birth pangs. Doesn't sound like the end to me. His words challenge us to endure hardship with faith and trust that God is working towards something far greater than we can ask for or imagine. And ultimately, Jesus' message in Mark today is about faithfulness. Faithfulness in uncertain times, like today. He reminds us that it's not our job to know when the end will come. Rather, it is our task to live faithfully in the meantime by grounding ourselves in faith and hope and compassion and love and grace and mercy. We can navigate through these uncertainties without fear or despair. We can do it because we are the cloud of witnesses, rooted and grounded in love, lifting up our loved ones, lifting up those on the margins of society, where our prayers are always for healing and peace and love and new life. We are St. David's. We'll always pray together with prayers inserting us into the reality of the cross and the resurrection of Christ, which is a story with a very good ending. Thanks be to God. Amen.